The pharmaceutical industry is a complex and fascinating field. It takes countless of people to bring a high quality product to the market. In the Qualitalks Podcast, I bring to you leaders, experts and innovators who will share their experiences and explain to us how they do it. Welcome to the Qualitalks Podcast. I'm Yan Kugel, your host, and my guest today is Dr. Mike Drues. Mike is an internationally recognized expert and featured keynote speaker on cutting-edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs. He is also the president of Vascular Sciences, an education training and consulting company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharma, and biotech companies. Today we are going to talk to Mike about medical device drug combination products. Mike, thank you for coming to the Qualitalks podcast. I have read your article about medical device drug combinations and I had to talk to you.
Thank you, Yan. I appreciate the invitation to speak with you and your audience, and I'm glad there's at least one person out there that read that article.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are much more. And again, you're a real veteran in podcasts, so you have a million of them already. So
I don't know about a million, but there are certainly a lot.
Quite a lot, yes. So they go back to 2017 or something like this.
I guess that's a polite way of reminding me that I'm getting old.
So guys, after you finish listening to this podcast, and only after you finish this, go to Mike's website. We'll mention it a bit later, and make sure to watch and listen to his other podcasts. So today we want to talk about medical device drug combinations. So Mike, what is your background in the field?
Sure. So let me just take a half a step back behind that for those that don't know me. My background is in biomedical engineering. That's what my PhD is in. But I don't do a lot of engineering per se anymore. I started out in this business almost 30 years ago as an R&D engineer before transitioning to the dark side, not marketing, but in my case, regulatory. And so, yeah, now I spend the vast bulk of my time working as a regulatory consultant, helping companies bring medical products, including combination products, through the FDA and onto the market here in the United States, as well as in other places in the world as well. And specifically with regard to combination products, I've been working in the area of combination products for more than 20 years, longer than probably most people even heard that phrase. I also work as a consultant for the FDA, as well as a couple of the other regulatory agencies around the world. And the reason why I mentioned that, Yan, is because there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence. And so I really try to use that to my advantage.
That's perfect. So let's go a bit into the definition of medical device drug combinations. So the laws are quite new.
Well, when you say new, Yan, if you're referring to the regulation itself, then yes, that is relatively new. We've only recognized combination products in a regulatory sense since the 1990s. However, it's important to point out that combination products have been around for a very, very, very long time, long before that. Some of the earliest examples would be catheters with silver or other kinds of antimicrobial coatings, condoms with spermicide gels, transdermal patches. There's a litany of combination products that have been around for many, many, many decades. It's only until sort of recently where we've recognized them in a regulatory sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So those products were here and are here for a long time. For example, insulin shots that come together already with the syringe.
Absolutely.
So it's one example.
That's, as a matter of fact, that's a wonderful example. Not just insulin, but preloaded or pre-filled syringes. As a matter of fact, that is a type of combination product. But preloaded syringes have been around nearly 500 years. So
really, for example,
yes, I can provide, if you want, I can provide the reference for our audience to fact check. But these things have been around for a very, very long time. So on a lighter note, Yan, I kind of get a kick out of it when I hear people talk about, how so much of what we do in medicine is new, but it's really not new. I guess it depends on what your definition of new is. But I think fundamentally, maybe one place to start here is what is a combination product? Because you've referred already a couple of times to medical device drug combination products. That, in fact, is a combination product, but it is only one type of combination product. The combination product universe is a very, very broad universe. So, simply put, a combination product, and I'm talking about now here in the United States, and other places it might be a little bit different, but in the US, a combination product is not just a medical device or a drug or a biologic, but a combination of two, sometimes even all three of those things put together. So it can be a device drug combination, it can be a device biologic combination, or it can even be a drug biologic
Mm-hmm.
combination, which has no device component to it at all. For example, attaching a chemotherapeutic, which is a drug, to a monoclonal antibody, which is a biologic, a protein, that for a cancer patient, for example, and I'd be happy to talk more about that if you want to, but that is an example of a combination product where there's no medical device component. So bottom line, combination products is a very, very broad area.
Yeah, it's quite broad. It's really interesting because the uh, USA law has groups that start from the basic designs like syringes, and they become more complicated with bioengineered cells and genetic engineering.
Yeah, there's a lot of different combinations that we can use to put products together. So, and take it one step further. So, what I just mentioned a moment ago, in terms of a combination product being a device drug, a device biologic, or a biologic drug, those are the only combinations that are recognized by the regulation currently here in the United States. But one of the cool things about my job, Yan, is I get an opportunity to work with all kinds of products that are in the regulatory gray areas, for example. So, how about putting a nutraceutical on a medical device? How about incorporating a drug into a food? Or how about this as a not so hypothetical scenario, Yan? How about identifying a gene that lowers your cholesterol and putting that gene into a plant like a potato, or putting that gene into an animal like a cow? Imagine what a company like McDonald's can do with their marketing claims of eat your greasy cheeseburger and French fries and lower your cholesterol at the same time. What I
Mhm.
just described to you is the idea of therapeutic foods,
Mhm.
also in the gray area of combination products. So, one of the takeaways that I hope our audience comes away with after listening to our discussion today is, first of all, combination products is a very, very broad area. That's number one. And with all due respect to my many friends working in combination products, the combination products that we have today, like transdermal patches, like prefilled syringes, like drug-eluting stents, and so on, this is just the beginning. This is just the tip of the iceberg. This is truly the lowest of the low-hanging fruit compared to what we can and hopefully will have in the future.
I come from biotechnology background. I've studied biotechnology for about 7 years. Never get the chance really to get my hands dirty with it because I went directly to pharma in quality. But everything you said was always presented for us as the future. Implant genes that are therapeutic to humans, etc. And I see it as the future. The question how the general public sees it, I really think it is rooted now in our community that gene manipulation is dangerous, although I see that the potential is enormous, as you say.
Well, of course, what you're referring to, Yen, is the general area of GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. I mean, that's obviously a topic of a different discussion. You mentioned the concern that the public has, which is certainly, a legitimate factor to consider. The concern that I have to deal with almost on a day-to-day basis, working with companies, is the concerns that the regulatory agencies have, including the FDA. Because no matter how good you think your technology is, how beneficial it is to patients, if you can't get it through the appropriate regulatory authority, you can't get it onto the market, it's not going to help anybody.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting issue, actually. So you have For example, for drugs, you have one way of perform clinical trials and registering the product, and medical devices, for example, you have a different route, and the same probably for other biological products. So how is it done in a combination product?
It's a great question. And in the interest of full disclosure, I mentioned earlier, perhaps one of the most common, one of the best known examples of a combination product is the drug-eluting stent. For those in the audience that are not familiar with stents, you can kind of think about it as a little metal tube that we put into an artery, for example, maybe a coronary artery in the heart, to keep the artery open to prevent the patient from having what's called an acute myocardial infarction or a heart attack. A bare metal stent will work okay, but sometimes they tend to close up again, what we call restenosis. So in order to minimize the chances of that, we put a drug on that stent to try to prevent that happening, i.e. a drug-eluting stent. Now, by definition, we have a combination product. The reason why I mentioned that, Yan, is because in the interest of full disclosure, I was one of the principal architects of the first drug-eluting stent, the first major combination product to get onto the market here in the United States. Now, one thing our audience has to remember is if you're developing a Me Too, again, I'll use the drug-eluting stent as a metaphor. Today, we have a number of drug-eluting stents on the market. So to bring a new drug-eluting stent onto the market is relatively easy in the sense that you have other people's footsteps to follow in. But when we were the first ones to do this, we had nobody else's footsteps to follow it. And what you just mentioned a moment ago is an incredibly important point. When we bring a drug onto the market, let's just talk about the clinical trial piece, for example. In the drug world, as you coming from pharma, you know that we have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Well, in the medical device world, we don't have anything like that. As a matter of fact, occasionally I'll hear people talk about a medical device clinical trial in the context of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And right away, I know they don't know what the heck they're talking about. Because in the medical device world, it's different. Mechanistically, it's different the way we organize a clinical trial. So without getting into too much detail here, how do we merge? One of the biggest challenges is how do we merge these two dissimilar clinical trial designs? And as I often have to do, if I'm the first one to do it, not only do I have to come up with a plan that makes sense, but then I got to go to the FDA and sell it to them. So when you're doing something that, let's be honest, 10 or 20 or 50 people have done before, following in somebody else's footsteps is easy. But when you're the first or second, it's not so easy.
It's really difficult to come up with the plan that the FDA or other agency are happy with it, and we really need to have a good risk basis and the risk evaluation.
Correct. And if I can take that one step further, Yan, because I think this is a good discussion for our audience. Let's be honest. The vast majority of products that we have in medicine in general, not unique to combo products, but medical devices, drugs, everything, the vast majority of them are Me Too. And most companies are very, very reluctant to be the first through the doors at the FDA with anything new for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is the unknown regulatory pathway. Me, being the contrarian that I am, I love to be the first through the doors at the FDA with something truly new. Why? Because if I'm the second or third and I want to do something different than what the people did before me, now I have to argue that what they did before me is not appropriate or maybe flat out wrong, and what I want to do is better. Don't get me wrong. I've been successful both ways, but given a choice, I would much prefer to be the first because I don't have that baggage, if you will, to carry along with me that other people have had. But I'll be honest with you, Yan, at least in my experience, most people don't look at it that way. Most people want to be, a sheep as opposed to a shepherd.
Be the first because then you make the rules. That's what you want to say.
You certainly have a big influence to influence the FDA on the rules so that that will then determine what other people have to do. And actually, Jan, you're alluding to something that I call competitive regulatory strategy. And again, I know we're going off on a lot of tangents here, but the idea of competitive regulatory strategy is it's easy to get a medical product onto the market. That's, something that I do all the time. The challenge is, how do we get it onto the market and at the same time make it more difficult for our competitors to follow in our footsteps? That is an aspect of regulation, Yan, that at least in my experience, most regulatory folks don't even think about. Using regulation as a tactical weapon against your competition, that's a powerful idea. Would you agree?
Yeah. So it's something that generic companies constantly do to overrule patents, and usually it's something that lawyers think about and not regulators in the pharma.
Well, I'm certainly not an attorney, nor do I play one on TV, but from a regulatory perspective, I use competitive regulatory strategy whenever I can.
If you have some implant that releases a drug and you can test it only in this environment, how do you go about it?
So it's a great question, Jan. The shortest, the most accurate, and the most succinct answer to every question in regulatory affairs is it depends. It depends. And I know that kind of a response drives scientists and engineers crazy. I have a PhD in engineering. I understand that mentality, but it does depend. What does it depend on? Well, one of the first thing it depends on is, let's talk about the drug side of the equation for the moment. Is this a new drug or an existing drug? Clearly, if you have a new drug, whether it's just a new drug or a new drug in a combination product, obviously the regulatory burden is going to be much higher. But coming back to the drug-eluting stent as a metaphor, we purposely chose existing drugs or derivatives of existing drugs to put on that stent, even though we knew that they were not, underline not, the best choice to make. In other words, we had other drug candidates, new drug candidates at the time that looked more promising, that looked more beneficial. But because of the additional regulatory burden, the additional regulatory risk, we knew that it was going to be, quite frankly, a heck of a lot more burdensome for the company to go with a new drug on the stent as opposed to an existing drug. One of the concepts that's important, not to get into too much of the regulatory weeds here, Jan, is one of the concepts in combination products that is important is something called the primary mode of action, or PMOA. PMOA essentially means, okay, this combination product, this drug-eluting stent, it has a device component, it has a drug component, but which is the most important? If the most important component is the device, then it's the device folks at the FDA that are leading the shots. On the other hand, if the most important component is the drug, then it's the drug folks that are calling the shots.
Can you give an example of both of them?
Well, okay, so let me finish the drug-eluting stent example. So we purposely chose a existing drug, even though we knew that it was not the best, largely to be able to argue from a risk perspective that we're going with an existing drug, and therefore it's not as risky. There's a known history. Yes, we haven't used this drug on the stent before, but we've used it in other places before. And that was one of the ways that we could hedge our bets, so to speak, to keep it as primarily as a drug. The primary mode of action of a drug-eluting stent is device, is mechanical. If we went with a new drug, I'm not suggesting that we would not have been successful getting it regulated primarily as a device. It would have been much, much more difficult to do. Mm-hmm. So that would be one example of a product where the PMOA is a device. If you want an example of a PMOA that's drug, you mentioned one of the best earlier, and that is a prefilled syringe. The drug is the most important component of that, right? The drug is what's going into the body and doing whatever it is that the drug is supposed to do. The syringe is nothing more than the delivery system to get it into the patient. Okay, well, let's do a real quick compare and contrast between the drug-eluting stent and the prefilled syringe. One could easily argue that a drug-eluting stent is nothing more, in fact, than an implantable prefilled syringe. In other words, the stent is carrying the drug into the body, And once the stent is deployed, then the drug is slowly released or eluted from the stent to do whatever it is that drug is supposed to do. So another thing that I'm trying to emphasize to you and your audience is that even though a drug-eluting stent and a pre-filled syringe seem like they're very different, really, they're not that different at all. Discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. So if I look at a drug-eluting stent, for example, and I think pre-filled syringe, that gives me tremendous insight into developing a regulatory strategy to get that kind of a product onto the market, especially if as I talked about before, Yan, if I'm doing it for the first time. Looking for similarities where no similarities seem to exist. It's a very important skill.
So how do you go about with a new drug that maybe have no effect unless it is combined with another product?
So now you're actually into a very interesting area. So as I said, if you're going with a new drug, whether it's a straight up drug or a combination product, it doesn't matter. But I hope everybody in our audience appreciates if you're going with a new drug, what we call an NME, a new molecular entity, then clearly that's going to have a higher regulatory burden because that drug has no history, no safety, efficacy, blah, blah, blah. So sometimes what I suggest to companies is try the drug first. Get the drug onto the market first if you can as a straight up drug. And then once you do that, create your combination product. In other words, decouple the device from the drug, at least for the moment. If you can deliver the drug maybe via a pill or something like that, get the drug on the market first. And most of the time you can do that. But if you cannot, if the drug must be delivered using some sort of a medical device, now you're going to have no matter how you slice this, Yan, you're going to have a much more work to do because you're going to have to validate that drug. You're going to have to validate the delivery system, the device. You have to validate those two things separately, and then you put the whole thing together. So another of my strategies when I work on combination products, before considering the overall combination as one single product, decouple them into individual components. So look at if it's a drug device, look at the drug separately, look at the device separately, and then once you do that, put them all together and look at the system.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you have an antibody that delivers an anti-cancer drug, test them separately for safety before you move on to the second step.
If you can, not always can you do that. Going back to the drug antibody combination. In some cases, we can use a naked antibody, a monoclonal antibody, for example, without attaching it to any drug. And if you can do that, then great. In some cases, you can't. But we have to sort of evaluate it on a case-by-case basis.
You can test them then only for safety because probably as a standalone, they would have no positive effect because but you need to check if the antibody for itself doesn't cause other biochemical reactions.
Again, it depends on the situation. It's hard. We have to be careful about overgeneralizing here. But perhaps looking at Herceptin, is a classic example of an antibody, monoclonal antibody for breast cancer. Right, that has therapeutic value just as the antibody itself. If we attach that to a chemotherapeutic, then we can test the two. We can get the efficacy of the combined product. Similarly, on the device side, again, I'm just using the drug-eluting stent because that's probably the most commonly known example. Bare metal stents, that is a stent without a drug, have been used for nearly 20 years before we started putting drugs on them. So we had a long history of safety and efficacy of bare metal stents. How effective they were, that sort of depends on who you ask. But then to add a drug on top of it, that was, I don't want to say it was easy to do, but it was relatively easy because we already had a long history of the device. We also had a long history of the drug without the device, and now we just put the two together. But hypothetically speaking, if nobody had used or heard of a stent before, and we came to the FDA with a drug-eluting stent with a new drug and a new stent, oh my gosh, now we're talking about a ton of work to do.
How difficult it is to get statistical clinical data actually in this field right now? Because as you said, it's much easier if somebody already done it. Of course, you would have to follow the rules, but how common is the clinical data at this point?
So I think what you're referring to, if I understand your question, and please feel free to ask again if you want. If you're working on, let's be honest, if you're working on a Me Too, which is very similar to other products that are already out there, the answer to your clinical trial question is pretty easy. First, go look at what other people have done. So let's say, hypothetically speaking, there were 10 clinical trials done on similar products for other companies. And again, I'm just going to make up numbers here, but let's say on average, they all used between 300 and 500 patients. If I go to the FDA and I say, okay, I'm going to do a clinical trial and the statistical power of my study is 400 patients. Why? Because it's kind of in the middle of what people have done in the past. You can also look at guidance. FDA puts out guidance on a lot of products, and sometimes they will make suggestions on the power of the study and so on. But to me, it doesn't make sense to use a number that somebody else has already used or a number that FDA says in the guidance unless it makes sense from a biology and engineering perspective first. And this goes back to what we just talked about a moment ago, Yan, when we said, if you have a existing drug, clearly you can get away with less clinical data. If you have a new drug, clearly you're going to need more clinical data. I mean, to me, that's common sense, right? So one thing that people have to understand about the FDA, and remember, as I mentioned at the beginning, I work as a consultant for the agency, so I see these things from both sides. When FDA is doing their job, and let's be honest, they don't always do their job, but when they're doing their job is to be critical of everything. So I don't know what the weather is like where you are right now, but here in Southern California, it's almost always a sunny blue sky. If I were to walk into the FDA and said the sky is blue, FDA's job is to say, okay, prove it. So I need to have some logical argument as to why I'm choosing whatever number that it is, 300, 400, 500. And I'll let you in on a little secret here, Yan. I have to be careful. Obviously, we're doing this in a recorded podcast. I have to be a little careful what I say. But sometimes when I'm sitting on the FDA side of the table and a company comes in and they say, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And I say, why are you doing X, Y, and Z? If they give to me some response that's based on the engineering and the biology, in other words, if they can demonstrate to me, quite frankly, that they understand and they know what the heck they're doing, then I'm going to give them a little more latitude, a little more leeway, as opposed to somebody else who might say, well, I picked 400 because the 5 guys that did this before me also used 400. I don't know about you, Yan, but to me, that's not the way this game is supposed to be played, and I will be all over that person like a cheap suit. Now, how many FDA reviewers do this? I don't know. I suspect probably not many. But to me, yeah, obviously regulation is important, but it's not a matter of ticking boxes on a form. We have to do what makes sense.
How was it before the new regulations? Was it easier or more difficult?
Well, prior to the early 1990s, at least here in the United States, prior to when the original, what's called the Safe Medical Devices Act was kicked in, and I think in about 1992, as I recall, could be off, plus or minus a year. That's the first time that's the first time Congress introduced the combination product and specifically the primary mode of action concept into the regulatory vernacular. But prior to that, combination products were regulated on sort of a case-by-case basis. And some people, refer that to the good old days. I mentioned earlier the condoms with spermicide jellies and the catheters with antibacterial coatings. I mean, there was a long list of combination products that were on the market long before, 1992 or 1994, wherever it was. And so those things were regulated on a case-by-case basis. And basically, you would have to go into the FDA, kind of like I just described a moment ago, and say, here's our product, this is what it does, this is how it works, and this is the way that we're going to test it, benchtop, animal, clinical, whatever. You had to, kind of sell your argument because there was no regulation to follow per se.
So now there are regulations and they make from the life sometimes harder, I guess, for people. But do you find that they make sense and they lead to safer products in the end?
So now we're going down a very interesting path. um, let me say it this way, Yan. Every single week, as a professional biomedical engineer, never mind as a regulatory consultant, but as a professional biomedical engineer, I read regulation that makes absolutely no sense, and yet people follow it anyway, which even makes less sense to me. So another thing that differentiates my approach to regulatory compared to so many others, because let's be honest, there's a lot of regulatory consultants out there, but they're not all equally as good. You know, as I used to say, I used to teach medical school back in the day, and there's an adage I used to share with my medical students. Every surgeon has graduated from medical school, but does that mean that every surgeon is equally as good? Of course not. The same thing can be applied to engineers and attorneys and, dare I say it, regulatory professionals. So when the regulation makes sense, then by all means follow it. But if the regulation doesn't make sense, or if it's not possible to follow the regulation, then don't follow it. But let me, put an important caveat on that. I'm not advocating, breaking the rules. I'm certainly not advocating anarchy. But if the regulation doesn't make sense, or if it's not possible, you need to go to the FDA or whatever authority that you're dealing with in whatever part of the world you're working, and say, here's my product, here's what the regulation says, it doesn't make sense for all of the following reasons, and instead here's what I'm going to do. And this is something that I do a lot with the FDA, and more often than not, as long as what I'm proposing makes sense from a biology and an engineering perspective, to me, and that's the most important thing, we can make the regulation work. But you know what? There's an adage also that I used to share with my medical students. The surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. Have you heard that one before? The surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. Well, the regulatory equivalent of that is we followed the regulation perfectly. That is, we did all that FDA or Health Canada or EU, whoever it is, asked us to do, and yet the patient died anyway. Regrettably, Yan, these things happen more frequently than some people might like to think. And so the solution, in my opinion, is not to create more regulation, because we've already got tons and tons of that. The solution is to get people to think. That's not such an easy thing to do.
So how easy is it to bypass such regulation? So it's a law, so it probably depends on your luck with whom you're talking.
Well, again, please, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I don't want to give the impression that we're bypassing regulation, or that we're taking shortcuts, or that we're not doing tests because we just don't want to spend the time or the money. On the contrary, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying let's do what makes sense, whether it's in the regulation or not. I'll give you a perfect example, Yan. One of the cool things about my job is I get the opportunity to go into a lot of companies. Of course, with the COVID crisis, we can't do that right now, but I get an opportunity to go into a lot of companies, into their R&D labs, into their manufacturing facilities. And I'll see, for example, they're doing a particular test. And I'll ask them, okay, why are you doing this test? More often than not, they'll say to me, well, because FDA or somebody requires us to do that test. Okay, fair enough. But if they didn't require you to do this test, would you do it? Absolutely not. It provides no useful value. On the other hand, Yan, I walk into those exact same companies. I see that they're not doing a particular test that I think as a biomedical engineer they should be doing. And I ask them, why are you not doing this test? Because nobody tells us that we have to do it. So regrettably, Yan, and I take absolutely no pleasure about saying this about our industry, but I'm just being brutally honest here. Regulation has become a convenient excuse for a lot of people to hide behind, not just to justify what they do, but what they don't do. And one of the many things that differentiates my approach to this game compared to so many else, I'm not advocating, as you phrased it earlier, bypassing the regulations. That's not the message I'm trying to make here. Instead, I'm trying to say, if the regulation makes sense, follow it. But if not, we need to go to the authority. We need to present our arguments. We need to convince them as to why the regulation doesn't make sense, at least not in the for our particular product. And then we need to propose them or tell them what we're going to do instead. In my opinion, Yan, that is the way this game is supposed to be played.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll take it just one step further. I characterize the entire relationship between the company and the FDA as a poker game in every sense of the word. And just because somebody understands the rules of poker doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good poker player. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win the game. I want to do everything I can, legal, of course. I don't want to be wearing any orange jumpsuits in order to win the game, right? You can read 50 books on the rules of poker. Does that mean that you're going to win the game? Not necessarily. Something to think about.
Yeah, that's true. So in such cases, when you say go to the FDA, talk to them, in such cases, do you need to wait for the regulations to change, or you get some specific, authorization to proceed with different guidelines?
Well, that's an interesting question. If we were to wait until the actual regulation changes, we would be waiting for a very long time. Because just to, again, not to get into the regulatory weeds too much, but the regulation comes from Congress. It does not come from the FDA. Guidance documents and other kinds of things, that comes from the FDA. So your question was specifically, do we wait until the regulation changes? Well, let's put it this way, without getting into politics, Congress is not exactly known for making, quick decisions and making quick changes. But here's the most important thing for companies. When I go to the FDA, and I'm, again, when we're allowed to travel, but I'm usually at the FDA, once a month. I'm on the phone with them, often more than that. What I try to do is I try to get into an agreement for this particular product that I happen to be working on at the time, whether it's a combo product or something else, that this is what we're going to do as an alternative to what might be specified in the guidance, right? So again, not to get into the regulatory weeds, but regulation is quote unquote binding. In other words, normally you have to do it. Although I don't see regulation as being completely binding, because if it doesn't make sense, then I'm going to propose something else. Guidance, on the other hand, is not binding. As a matter of fact, it says on the cover of most of the new guidance documents coming out of FDA now, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but this is what FDA sort of expects. It's not required. If you want to do something alternative to this, that's fine. But my suggestion, or FDA suggestion, and my suggestion too, is to take it to the FDA in advance in the form of, say, a pre-submission meeting or a pre-sub, to make sure that everybody is on the same page. I see it happen a lot with companies where they decide not to follow a guidance. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but they don't let the FDA know until the actual submission goes in. And at that point, you might as well just put a big red flag on the top of your submission saying, don't even bother to read the rest of this thing, just throw it right back in my face. So companies would be wise, in my opinion, if they're going to do something different than what's specified in a guidance, take that to the FDA, in advance of your submission. You're not required to, but that's usually my advice, to make sure that everybody is on the same page.
Yeah, so it makes sense. You need to work with the agency as partners. You don't need
Correct.
to from one side you said it's like a poker game, but it also should be a friendly match. Right?
Friendly, but sometimes these do get heated. I mean, another metaphor that I sometimes use is it's like the legal system, at least the legal system here in the United States. There's a prosecution and there's a defense. And there's supposed to be a certain degree of conflict, between the two. Obviously, you should be polite, you should be respectful, but at the end of the day, you have two completely different views here, and there's supposed to be a bit of a friction, tension, whatever you want. It's not supposed to be a fist fight, obviously, although sometimes these meetings can get a bit heated. But that's the way this game, in my opinion anyway, is supposed to be played. And getting back to combination products in particular, because that is the general subject of today's conversation, I would take my recommendation that I made a moment ago in terms of going to the FDA in advance of your submission a step further, specifically when you're dealing with a combination product. Let's, again, assume that we're talking about a device-drug combination product. Remember, we're going to have the device folks involved. We're going to have the drug folks involved. Let's make sure from the beginning, or from early on in this process, that everybody is in agreement. Very often what happens is the device people and the drug people in FDA will see things differently. And so the last thing that I want to happen is to make a submission that, say, satisfies the drug folks, but not the device folks, or vice versa. So when I say get an agreement with the agency, that's true for all products, but especially when it comes to combination products, make sure that you have the different centers that you're going to be involved with, whether it's CDER for drugs, CDRH for devices, CBER for biologics, whoever it is. Make sure that everybody's in agreement. And this is one of the things that the Office of Combination Products, or OCP at FDA, usually gets involved with, is trying to help manage those intercenter relationships.
You also talked about it in your publication, which I found a really interesting point. When we are talking about combination products, it means we have different types of specialists that come from different field of work, and it makes the work a bit more complicated because each specialist speaks in a different language. Can you elaborate about it a bit?
Absolutely. So we've talked a bit about drug device combination products. Let's come back to something right up your street as a molecular biologist. Let's talk about a biologic device combination product. And never mind putting a drug on a stent, which we've been doing now for a very long time. Let's talk about putting a gene inside of a virus on a stent. So now you have engineers and molecular biologists that are trying to talk to one another. So fundamentally, engineers look at the world from an F equal ma perspective. For those that are not familiar, F equal ma, force equals mass times acceleration. That's the governing law of dynamics. Okay, that's the way that engineers look at the world. A molecular biologist, and I think you said earlier, Yan, that your training, prior to doing this is in molecular biology. So a molecular biologist looks at the world from an A, T, G, and C perspective. A, T, G, and C, of course, are the nucleotides that go into the DNA, right? So there's not a lot of overlap between F equal ma and A, T, G, and C. Well, in fact, yes, there is. There's an A in both of them. And usually when I say this in my live presentations, Yan, there's a few people that chuckle because they realize the point that I'm trying to make. The vast majority of people that don't laugh don't get the metaphor. The A in F equal ma and the A in A, T, G, and C are obviously very different. Right. So one of the biggest challenges that we face in combination products, and in my opinion, it's probably the single biggest challenge, more so than the technology, more so than the regulation, more so than anything else, is the simple fact that we have people, engineers, molecular biologists, pharmacologists, that speak different language, that look at the world differently. And those kinds of bridges, we're making progress, but that, in my opinion, is what is really holding us back compared to what some of the really cool, or coming originally from Boston, what we call wicked cool kinds of products that we have. Because remember, as I said earlier, and I mean this sincerely, as helpful and as successful as many of the combination products that we have today on the market, from a biomedical engineering perspective, most of them bore me to tears. I mean, they're so simple. They're so easy compared to what we could have in the future. And I understand that, we're making progress and, that's fine, but it's just taking a very long time.
So what is the solution?
Well, clearly, more education is always an advantage. Universities can certainly, provide that, but people working in companies can take advantage of educational opportunities as well. A portion of my business is doing training for companies as well as the FDA, either face to face or online or seminars and webinars and podcasts and even the conversation that you and I are having today. So education in any shape or form is valuable. But here's another way that I would illustrate specifically the challenge that we have in combination products. I have a lot of people that I've met over the years, for example, that have worked in medical device companies, and then they shift to a drug company. and they tell me they are totally overwhelmed at how much work they have to do to get a drug onto the market here in the US as opposed to a medical device. On the flip side, I have lots of people come to me with, that have worked most of their lives in the pharma industry. Then they go to a medical device company and they're totally underwhelmed at the little bit of work that they have to do to get a medical device onto the market. Coming from the drug world, Yan, let me share a medical device statistic with you. It's not a combo product statistic, just straight up medical devices. And that is greater than 95% by volume of the medical devices that we use here in the United States today in 2020, greater than 95% of them have never been tested in a human being in a clinical trial. Now, can you say that for the, whether it's a good or bad, that's a different discussion, but it is true. Could you say that about the pharma industry?
No, of course not.
Absolutely not.
No,
absolutely not.
But it's interesting that you're saying it. It's really surprising, because I would say that medical devices sometimes are even more critical. Their drugs in their registration. Why? Because you don't test them on a healthy or a huge amount of patients. You test them on a much smaller scale. So it's really interesting that you said, because I would say that the work, the statistic, and the risk analysis that you should do, in my point of view, should be even greater than the drugs, because you don't test it clinically.
Okay, so again, I want to be a little careful. I want to, make sure that we don't, mislead people here.
Yeah.
So when I say that greater than 95% by volume of medical devices have not been tested in human beings in clinical trials, that is factually correct, but there's a couple of caveats that we have to put onto it. The first is there's a litany of reasons why a company may do a clinical trial that have nothing to do with the FDA. So, for example, they might do it for health economic reasons to get reimbursement. They might do it for clinical adoption reasons to get physicians to use your product. So there's a lot of reasons why a company might do a clinical trial that have nothing to do with regulatory or FDA. That's caveat number one. Caveat number two, remember, unlike the drug world, the medical device world is a very broad universe. On one end of this universe, we have things like Band-Aids and wheelchairs and EKG monitors. All the way through to the other end, we have things like totally implantable artificial hearts. So let's say, for the sake of discussion, Yan, I'm developing a new Band-Aid. Do I need to do a randomized clinical trial for my Band-Aid of hundreds or maybe thousands of patients like we would in the drug world? And here's another thing to keep in mind for you and our audience, Yan, the differences between the medical device industry and the drug industry. For the most part, drug companies are all, pretty big companies, right? But in the medical device world, not so much. Here's an interesting statistic for you. 80% of medical device companies, at least here in the United States, I don't know about in other places, but 80% of medical device companies have 50 or fewer employees. I'll say that one more time. 80% of device companies have 50 or fewer employees. So another challenge, and I see this almost every single day with the projects that I work on, is how does this tiny little medical device company that might have a couple of dozen people or less working in it work with this monstrosity of a pharma company that might have thousands or tens of thousands? That pharma company probably has more departments than the number of people working in the medical device company.
Yeah, that's true.
So the point that I'm trying to make, again, I understand that, our discussion here is for a broad audience. Yeah, there are technical challenges. Yeah, there are regulatory challenges. But some of the biggest challenges that we face in combo products are actually the non-technical, the non-clinical, the non-regulatory challenges, like the ones you and I have been discussing in the last few minutes.
Yeah. So how do you get into this world? If you have, for example, somebody that comes especially from pharma or medical device, he doesn't have, he or she don't have all this experience. How do you start in this field?
Well, it's a great question. I'm a big fan of the adage sink or swim, right? So just immerse yourself. Just don't stick your toe in. Just kind of dive in head first, and maybe get try to get a job in a company that's developing combination products. If you're working in a company right now that is only developing drugs or medical devices, maybe float as an idea to your senior management. Hey, would there be any advantage of us combining our product with one of these other products? And if they express, maybe some potential positive to that, you might volunteer to say, you know what, I'd be happy to do some preliminary due diligence to see what would be involved. Certainly, as we talked about before, education, either on the technical side, on the regulatory side. In the interest of full disclosure, I teach in a couple of academic programs, regulatory affairs kinds of courses. Many of these now are offered online. So there's a lot of schools and universities that offer these kinds of things. I would just be careful. I don't want to mention specific schools or specific universities, but just like I said about surgeons earlier, every surgeon has graduated from medical school. Not every surgeon is equally as good. Well, the same can be said about universities, and especially their regulatory programs. I used to teach in many regulatory programs over the years. I've cut way back for a number of reasons, but one of them is I personally believe that the quality of the education in a lot of these programs, quite frankly, is not very good. Even though they meet their requirements, so to speak, the quality is not very good. And I find it ironic that since they're supposed to be teaching these regulatory and quality professionals, regulatory and quality concepts, and yet the schools don't seem to follow them themselves. Anyway, that's it. So bottom line, educate yourself, try to get into an organization that is already working on these things. There's a lot of ways that you can do, a lot of things that you can do. Talk to people, even like myself, that have experience and see what they would suggest. So it can be done.
How do you see the future of those combination products? Let's talk science fiction. Let's talk what's now and what can be.
Okay, great question, Yan. And again, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I mentioned several times today the drug-eluting stent. So let me point out one of the biggest disadvantages of drug-eluting stent, and then I'm going to turn that into a huge positive. Okay, so if a patient has a heart attack and a portion of their heart dies, becomes what we call necrotic, we can put in a stent. We can put in a drug-eluting stent. We can put in 100 drug-eluting stents if we want to. But from the perspective of the part of the heart that has actually died, have we accomplished anything? Absolutely not. Nothing whatsoever. In medicine, this is what we call palliative relief, preventing the problem from getting worse. And for decades in medicine, not just in cardiology, but in all areas of medicine, this is essentially what we've been doing, preventing the problem from getting worse. But as a biomedical engineer, Yan, that's not good enough for me. I don't want to simply prevent a patient's heart from getting worse. I want to erase the damage in the heart caused by the heart attack as if the patient never knew they had a heart attack to begin with. I want to erase the damage in the pancreas caused by the insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, IDDM, so-called type 1 diabetes, as if the patient never knew they had the diabetes to begin with. I want to erase the damage in the brain caused by the Alzheimer's or the Parkinson's or the ischemic stroke, as if the patient never knew they had those things to begin with. I hope you and our audience appreciates, Yan, that I'm not talking about the next evolutionary step in medicine, going from Prilosec to Nexium, or going from one version of a stent to another. I'm talking about a revolutionary advance, a change in the ethos of how we approach medical problems. And the quintessential example of combination products, which, by the way, is no longer science fiction, is what we're starting to do now in the areas of tissue engineering, or what we sometimes refer to as regenerative medicine, and biomedical nanotechnology. Both technological areas that I've worked in for a very, very long time. Imagine not just slowing the progression of a disease or stopping a disease, but erasing the damage caused by that disease or that injury, as if the patient never knew they had that injury or that disease to begin with. I don't know about you, Yan, but that is something that all of us, not just, people like me, technical and regulatory geeks, but all of us working in medicine should get excited about.
Yeah.
That is the true future of combination.
Yeah. That's why I started biotechnology when I was still in high school. That was the dream that everybody was talking about, and this is the reason I went into it. And it's from day to day, it seems closer and closer, and we are living in fantastic times. And as you say, you're really close to it because you help with registration of drugs and devices. And how close are we to this reality?
Well, we're getting closer and closer all the time. Here's a quick example. So one of the first combination products that came in the area of tissue engineering came onto the market here in the United States in the early 1990s. I want to say around 1994, 95, something like that. Developed originally by a company, a division of Genzyme, which went on to be Genzyme Biosurgery and then was acquired by Sanofi and so on. But it's what we call Carticel, or autologous chondrocyte implantation. The idea is, in a nutshell, is if a patient has a defect of the articular cartilage in the knee, not osteoarthritis, but for example, a sports-related injury. Let's say we have an 18-year-old kid playing soccer and they injure their knee. The articular cartilage in the knee, it's supposed to last you your entire life. Well, if something lasts you your entire life, your body has no ability to really repair it. So once it becomes broken, it takes a very long time, or in some cases, it doesn't repair at all. So what are our options? Well, we can do a knee replacement, but here's the problem with that. A knee replacement, the average life expectancy right now is probably 12, maybe 15 years. So if you got somebody that's, 70 plus years old, doing a knee replacement probably makes sense. But if you have an 18-year-old kid, doing a knee replacement probably doesn't make sense, because the average life expectancy of the patient is going to far outpace the knee. So we have to try a different approach. So enter Carticel. In this particular case, what we do is we take a sample from the patient, we send it off to Genzyme, we culture the chondrocytes, the cells that produce the extracellular matrix, the cartilage. A couple of weeks later, in a second procedure, we inject them back into the knee. We take a little piece of the periosteum, the skin of the bone, we suture it over like a Band-Aid. And over the coming weeks and months, those chondrocytes do exactly what those chondrocytes are designed to do, and that is to produce new cartilage. And I have pictures. I can't show them over the video, but I have pictures of before and after. But what the defect looked originally, where you basically have a big hole there, and a few months down the road where there is absolutely no evidence, certainly no visual evidence of any defect there whatsoever. That, Yan, is a level of efficacy that we cannot achieve or even come close to achieving using a monotherapy, using a medical device or a drug or a biologic alone. But it is a level of efficacy that we can achieve with combination products, especially the kinds of combination products that we're talking about in the last couple of minutes. So on one hand, yeah, some of these things are still sci-fi, Star Trek-y, but on the other hand, some of them we have right now. And, for the sci-fi fans in the audience, good science fiction is always based on science fact. So, even though some of these things are still science fiction-y, many of them are coming to fruition, just taking a long time.
Yeah, and science fiction pushes the dreams, pushes the imagination, and in the end we will get there, and
Absolutely
we're
correct.
closer every day. And I just like 100 years ago, the expectancy of a person was for tens of thousands of years, it was the age of 30, and look where we came in 100 years. It's amazing.
And speaking of sci-fi, there's probably no better example than Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry, because Gene Roddenberry was brilliant. He predicted so many things, that, including things in medicine, that went on or inspired people and now we have them today. So
Okay, yeah, that's amazing. I don't have an example for from Star Wars for if there are somebody from the other club is listening, but yeah, so it sounds great.
I was
And
referring to Star Trek, not
Star
Star
Trek,
Wars, but
yeah,
okay.
that's what I mean. Yeah, so
Okay, okay.
yeah, from the Star Wars, so they don't get sad that we didn't mention them. Yeah, yeah. So
Alrighty.
that's a really fascinating topic, and I really want to thank you for talking to me about it. I'll leave your contact information in the article, and everybody who's listening, just go to qualistory.com and you will find it. So thank you very much, Mike, for coming to the podcast, and I will be happy to talk to you about other topics for sure.
Thank you, Yan, for the invitation. I enjoyed our discussion, and I look forward to speaking again in the future.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Qualitalks podcast. If you did, consider subscribing. Stay compliant and see you in the next one.